Hello and welcome to Pluribus Unum's Fireside Chats. Not as good as FDR's, but hey, it's something. Now, this episode, as you can take a guess, is very similar, if not basically the same premise as the third podcast in this series, which is again supposed to do the thing where it's like, oh, to celebrate 5 years, especially considering since that last episode came out, we have had not one, but 2 administrations that we can rank, because even though one of them is we'll get to that when we get to the final part of this part. So before we get into that, let's get right into the news. First, we're getting an update from Marcelo Ebrard. You see, Marcelo Ebrard has announced the creation of a civil association called El Camino de Mexico, which is basically going to be a sort of political movement, like a civil association / political movement that he intends to create, again, called that name. And he has actually managed to get a ton of people who were part of his campaign and generally members of the Morena party to join with his coalition, to join with his little thing. One of which being Yidko Polvensky, who is another person who sort of has a weird relationship with the Morena presidential primary process. For those who don't remember, Yidko, she used to be like the head of Morena, or at least she was like the temporary head of Morena. And then she tried to run for a full term as the leader of Morena, and it didn't turn out so well. And then she was one of the people who wanted to seek Morena's presidential nomination. But in doing so, she accidentally showed up a little bit later than the rest of the candidates. However, she claims that she was forbidden from entering the premises, thus guaranteeing that she wouldn't have a spot. So basically, this is going to be a group of people who are in the Morena party, but are in a sort of opposition to mainstream, Morena politics. Now, one thing Marcelo Ebrard has stated openly throughout this entire time was that this is not going to be a political party. But he's also stated that the reason why it is not a political party is because you cannot create political parties at this time period. It is just a civil association. But this is basically the same exact thing that happened with AMLO. Morena wasn't a political party to initiate with. It was a civil association within the PRD that he made and sort of was like, I'm just going to do this to move forward and help bring people into my movement. And then it became a political party. So either way, I think he's essentially trying to find his way out of the Morena movement. Whether this means formalizing it with a citizens movement campaign, we don't know. No updates from the citizens movement as of yet. But one thing I should mention here is that it seems that Marcelo Ebrard has probably been planning this for a while now, because his autobiography is also called El Camino de Mexico. So methinks that he was basically gearing up for an anti-Morena movement, basically throughout any scenario. He was basically planning his way out of Morena prior to the whole process at all. We'll have to wait and see how things pan out there. Speaking of things that we'll have to wait and see, Chicago may actually be doing something interesting. Appears that Brandon Johnson, due to many supermarkets leaving Chicago due to their high crime rate, Brandon Johnson has made it a point that he is interested in creating city-owned grocery stores. And the reason why he's doing so is because due to many grocery stores leaving Chicago, it is leaving a lot of people in Chicago without a lot of healthy food. They're basically being left in food deserts. Food deserts, for those who don't know, is when a area of a country doesn't have access to proper food. So it's usually they have only a fast food area within the appropriate amount of time period. I say good, especially if he's able to keep the prices in these state-run supermarkets down, because this is one of the big things. If you're doing a state-run, if you're doing a city-run or state-run, anything, make it so that prices within the thing are going to be cheap. For the state-run petroleum industry, make it sure that oil prices remain cheap, like how Pemex does in Mexico, or at least that's what you're supposed to do. As of right now, this is just an idea, and the right wing has already jumped on hating this idea, and that means it's a good thing. Speaking of good things, there's actually an interesting thing coming out of the California Senate race, because, as we all know, Barbara Lee's been having a little bit of trouble with her race. especially after something happened that made Barbara Lee, it made Barbara Lee look not good to a lot of people. I don't think I covered this one specifically because I had a hot take in regards to it. Basically, here's what happened. So, like, everybody's been clamoring for Dianne Feinstein to resign. And if Dianne Feinstein were to resign, she would be replaced with someone Gavin Newsom appoints. Same thing happened with Kamala Harris when she became Biden's vice presidential candidate. And one of the big things that many people have been saying is that the appointee to Feinstein's seat should be a black woman. And it just so happens that there is a black woman running for the Senate race already, Barbara Lee, one of the most prominent black female politicians within the state. And Lee has made it a point to position herself like, if that situation were to happen, she will happily take the seat. But there's one big problem. She's already running in the Senate race already, so it's like a little bit of conflict of interest. And then Gavin Newsom made a point to say that if he were to appoint somebody, he would appoint a person purely to be a careholder for the seat. He would not appoint someone like Barbara Lee who would intend to serve the full term, which led to Barbara Lee heavily criticizing him for this decision. And to an outsider's perspective, they see Barbara Lee trying to get Gavin Newsom to appoint her to the seat and saying, oh, she's clearly trying to rig the race in her favor. And a lot of people, even on the left, were clowning on her for this decision. However, let's look at this again, but from a bigger lens, because this situation didn't start with this seat. This situation all began with Kamala Harris when she had to leave to become the vice president. In that drama, a lot of people were clamoring for Gavin Newsom to appoint a black female senator, because she was the only black female senator, Kamala, and if Newsom appointed anybody else who was not a black woman senator, then the Senate would not have a black female senator. And a lot of names were floated out, including, but not limited to, Barbara Lee and Karen Bass. However, many other California politicians also were openly vying for the spot, including Ro Khanna and Alex Padilla, who ended up getting the seat at the behest of Dianne Feinstein, which made a lot of people really mad. So Newsom says, okay, so if Dianne Feinstein were to retire or die, I would gladly appoint a black female senator to replace her. And that satiated a lot of people. And also it satiated people by saying, like, okay, maybe this is just a temporary appointment. Like, this is a caretaker's seat. Because there would not only be a special election, but the regularly scheduled election was going to happen regardless. So basically, either way, they could, if they wanted to, they could replace like Alex Padilla, and he wouldn't really have any issues. But then Alex Padilla announced that he would be running for the full term. Like, he wouldn't just be running for the special election that would ensue, that would keep him around until the main election, but he would also run for the full 6-year term. And then he basically got everybody in the California establishment to endorse his bid for the office, thus guaranteeing that there would be no chance for a black woman to take that seat, thus again preventing a black woman from becoming part of the U.S. Senate. And Feinstein showed no indications that she was going to retire for her next term, but then came the more obvious indications that Feinstein's health was declining to the point where she really could not viably take the seat and be the senator anymore. So calls for her to resign and get replaced early on by a left of center black woman, especially during the California recall election, when there was a little bit of a worry that potentially a Republican would be able to take that seat and then appoint someone who is objectively worse for California. Newsom still won't budge, saying he'll wait for Feinstein herself to make the decision. Then her handlers decide to make the decision for her and decide to pull the plug on her, race. She won't be running for the next term and whatever. But there's a problem. That announcement came after two prominent white Democrats already announced their intentions to run for the seat should Feinstein retire. Katie Porter and Adam Schiff. So now, again, no black female Democrats are vying for the seat. Then Barbara Lee enters, but she enters way too late after those two swallow up prominent blocks within the party. And black Democratic candidates historically don't do so hot in regards to polling and financing and stuff. Lee has called this out herself previously during the 2022 midterms, pointing out that a lot of prominent black Democrats have to basically go it alone without help from the party because the party views them as a weakness. And you don't even have to look at it from like a Democratic strategist perspective. Even now, a lot of black candidates for some reason have a weird ire regarding them. Like, to this day, Mandela Barnes is regarded as a bad candidate, even though he was 1 point away from flipping the Senate seat. And he didn't do it with Democratic Party help. They look at Fetterman with love, and they look at Barnes with ire, even though there's nothing really remotely different between the two candidates, aside from them aesthetically looking different. So then they think, okay, since Lee has a problem with the race thus far, so maybe Newsom can help boost her odds by giving her the seat in the temporary. Then maybe if she's able to maintain a momentum when she's in the Senate, then we'll be able to have a good Senate run. But if not, there will still be two prominent good Democrats to replace her. But Newsom won't do that. He's making it a point that for the black woman specifically, he won't do this. He won't make it so that it's easier for her to be the Senate. He made it easy for people who weren't black women, but for black women specifically, it's like, no. This must specifically be done this way. But the good news is, she managed to win the endorsement of Our Revolution, which is going to help her in this recent thing. Even some of the people that were crapping on her are saying that this is going to be beneficial to her, at least in a little bit, because it's going to help a lot of people get to campaign with her on the ground. Speaking of campaigning on the ground, Donald Trump. Okay, so big interesting thing. Donald Trump is not going to be going to the second Republican presidential debate, but this time he's actually going to be doing something smart with this decision. Instead of going to the GOP debate, he will be going to Detroit, Michigan, to go and make a speech with striking auto workers during the UAW strike. And this shows you how Trump is still at the very least smarter than the rest of his compatriots. Because here's the interesting thing. Biden, as we all know, Biden has basically made a point to be the most pro-union president in our lifetimes. He's made it a big point to be this big union-type candidate, as unions are a very hardline Democratic base. Due to this, and the fact that the Republicans are usually based by a bunch of rich people, many of the GOP candidates have been making it a point to hate on the union and the strike that is going on right now. Tim Scott openly saying how if he were the one in charge, he would think that it'd be the best decision for the employers to just flat out fire striking workers. And Nikki Haley saying that, well, when Joe Biden's saying that he's the most pro-union president, what do you expect is going to happen? Meanwhile, Trump is making it a point to differentiate himself from the rest of the GOP by actually going to these workers. And I'm going to take a wild guess and say that if he goes there, he's going to blame a lot of the problems that they are facing on inflation and Biden. And the fact of the matter is, this is going to win some people over. So Biden needs to step out of the White House and step right on the picket line with them. And he needs to make it a point that that is what he needs to do. He needs to be on the picket line. He doesn't, no speeches, picket line only. But he needs to make it a point that he needs to make it so that he is the more pro-union of the two. Because if he doesn't, then there's going to be a problem. I don't think Biden has this much of an issue, as opposed to someone like Clinton. But we need to make sure, just in case. So anyways, speaking of things that are just in case this thing implodes, well, let's just get into it. Elon Musk suggests that Twitter will start charging all users a small monthly payment. Elon Musk says Twitter is considering having its users pay a small monthly payment to use the social media platform. On Monday, Musk made the remarks during a live stream conversation with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu about artificial intelligence, saying that the fee would be meant to keep bots off Twitter. It's the only way I can think of to combat vast armies of bots, he said. He also added that Twitter has 550 million monthly users that generate 100 million to 200 million posts a day. However, he didn't indicate whether he was factoring bots into that figure. And this is coming off the fact that many advertisers have decided to pull support from Twitter due to the fact that he is flat out trying to sue the Anti-Defamation League for accusing Twitter and him for promoting anti-Semitism, which they are, which the site has literally done. It was a hashtag started by Nick Fuentes that has started to get massive following on Twitter, and every day on Twitter now, you see at the very least one verified user that just flat out posts an extremely anti-Semitic comic, meme, or statement, and it's literally what he has done. Now, there are a lot of people who are still somehow perplexed about what Elon Musk is doing, but at this point, he's made it abundantly clear what he is doing, and it is just very objectively obvious. Because let's analyze this. Let's analyze Twitter. Twitter was probably the social media site that best exemplified the generation that we live currently. Most, if not all, of Twitter's base are people who are generally in the same age range. They're usually mid high school to early college type people. And it was always that way since its founding. Because it's supposed to be the most simplified of all the social media sites. Facebook was where you would post your statuses, and that's where you could post long, really, really long, boring things. Instagram is where you posted pictures, where you were it was so simplified you couldn't say anything. But Twitter was just enough that you could say stuff, but not enough that you would bore people. With the short, character range, you could just say something easy in a snap that people would remember. It would be very easy to organize on those social media sites that you could just go hashtag this thing, and then you would be able to click that hashtag, see all the massive movements with that hashtag, and whatever. And a lot of the people in that age range are typically people who are left-wing or lefter than most other social media sites. Facebook, of course, skews older, so it skews more right-wing. Twitter usually skewed younger and skewed to a lot more Facebook really literally Facebook is literally for old people and particularly old white people. You don't see a lot of minority people on Facebook unless you are a minority and you have a lot of minority people added on your Facebook page. Meanwhile, Twitter was so vast that people from all across the United States could easily add each other and not really feel any worried. If you added somebody that you didn't know on Facebook, that would be a little weird. But if you were mutuals with someone on Twitter that you didn't really know, that wasn't important because Twitter was known. Twitter was that was the site that made sense for you to have this big network of people. And the fact of the matter is, younger people are more active on social media. Twitter, people were more active. And due to this, that led to the rise of hashtag activism. A lot of prominent movements within modern day were started on Twitter. Black Lives Matter, Yo Soy 132, Me Too. Literally, all of these movements were started on Twitter, but then transitioned into bigger social activism. Hashtag March for Our Lives, again, started on Twitter. Think about how big some of these movements were. Yo Soy 132 literally got AMLO elected president of Mexico. Black Lives Matter is still a massive political movement that is going on to this day. Me Too got a ton of celebrities pulled from their jobs and lives because they sexually harassed people, finally holding celebrities accountable for the years-long sexual harassment that they had been doing. It got a senator to resign. March for Our Lives still has big impact in the gun control legislation to this day. Not all the movements that were started on stuff like Twitter were the best. Gamergate was started on Twitter. The Trump movement was started on Twitter, but again, it is a very impactful movement that was started on Twitter. This was the one where social activism was, this was the app of social activism. And that was the problem. It was an app where young people could organize, could get people's attention on issues, and it could spread news and stuff. It was both a detriment and a curse, because sometimes there was some bad faith actors that would use the sites to push for bad things. You know, bot armies that would spread misinformation from Russia, from Mexico, from China, from everywhere. The United States has bots armies on Twitter, all going around spreading misinformation. People would just go on and, without the need of bots, would just spread misinformation on their own. And that, of course, had a lot of issues that were, of course, addressed as the site grew, as they understood that the app was becoming more relevant for social causes. Now they started to change things. They added a fact check feature. They made it so that if you spread certain pieces of misinformation, you would be banned. To make sure people wouldn't pretend to be other people, they made an easy verification feature so that people who couldn't be misinterpreted and pretended to be imposters, they did all this to try and make sure that things wouldn't go wrong. And positive changes were coming from this. And of course, the right doesn't like that. And Elon Musk showed that. Because he point blank stated on the 8th of September that the reason why he bought Twitter was because he wanted to stop the woke mind virus, because it was turning his daughter against him. So right around the time that there's a new election that's going to happen, that is going to, of course, have a lot of people try to spread misinformation about the election, that we saw people spread misinformation in the last election, that they're putting safeguards to try and prevent in the future. All of a sudden, Elon Musk buys the site where the misinformation is spread the most heavily and is more susceptible to reach more people, and decides to basically remove every single safeguard that is needed to prevent misinformation from being spread in the upcoming election. And not only that, he lets all the people who were banned from the website that were spreading misinformation on the website, allows them to spew all of their extremely hateful, vitriolic ideas, all with 100% verification from Twitter, because they can buy the checkmark. And not only that, wants to make it so that the people who literally can't afford buying a checkmark or buying some sort of subscription fee to the site, and is just going to start paywalling the site for everybody. Elon Musk is actively trying to sway the next presidential election in favor of the Republicans. This is the fact. This is the fact of the situation. The right is actively trying to rig the election in favor of the Republicans. That they always do. They always do this. This always happens. And it is our duty to prevent that by any means necessary. Anyways, speaking of getting rid of something by any means necessary, Bob Menendez and his wife are indicted on bribery charges. The DOJ seizes gold bars and $500,000. This is just funny. So Bob Menendez is apparently regarded as one of the most very blatantly, obviously corrupt senators in the at least current United States Senate. And he's recently been, he's currently being indicted on bribery charges and apparently stealing gold bars. And it's just wow. And what is interesting is that a lot of people from his state, including the governor and a couple of the U.S. representatives, have already called on him to resign because, interesting fact, his race is actually up for grabs in the next, in 2024. His race is going to be one of the ones up for grabs. And due to the situation, I think Joe Signorello is, slamming his head in frustration because he was trying to primary Menendez, but decided to seek a House race instead because he thought that would be an easier race. But now, there's a good chance that he could have been the only candidate in the race should Menendez retire, and that would mean that he would have a good chance of being the senator. Very sad for him, but also very sad for Menendez. And in Hispanic, Heritage Month, no less, shame. Anyways, speaking of shame, now let's move on to the main topic of this episode. Yes, I'm going to be going back and re-ranking the presidents of the United States. Now, for those who don't remember, the third podcast in this series was me giving my rankings of all of the presidents of the United States at the time, with the exception of Donald Trump, because I felt that it was unfair to rank him this early into his term. And it was literally like 2 years, or I guess technically 1 year into his term. You see, because he was sworn in January of 2017, and I released that in March or April of 2018. So it was a little over a year into his term. So it was unfair for me to rank him in that. And I remember a quote from Psychic Pebbles where he said, It's most fair to judge a president after all of their term is complete, because that way we can fully understand the grasp of everything that has been happening in their plan. Because you can't just look at their 4 years and say, well, this is what happened. But you also have to go, okay, what happened in the immediate post their presidency? Because some of the policies that they enacted during their presidency will seep into the next presidency's term. Like how Obama got the blame for the housing crisis, even though that was because of the Bush administration. Same thing goes for Bush, where it was in the beginning of his administration, it was a surplus, I think, and the economy was doing great, and that was because of the Clinton years. Now that begs one question. Would I go by that same logic for the current president, Joe Biden? Well, I honestly can say no, because one, let's just say hypothetically, if Joe Biden doesn't win a second term, then we have enough it's been 3 years or 2 years into Biden's term, essentially. We understand what Biden has done thus far, and I think at this point, this is basically the kind of stuff we are going to be getting for the rest of the Biden administration. I might do a re-ranking if Biden wins a full 8 years and then in his last 4 years he does something incredibly amazing or does something incredibly bad. I don't know. But honestly, I think at this point I can honestly say that I think I know where Biden would end up in the ranking, and I'll just say what he is when he gets there. And for this, I actually did decide to look back through a lot of the previous administrations and see because I've learned a lot more since I first started the show, so I have a little bit more understanding of how the rest of the things went. So not everybody is going to be on the exact same spot as they were previously. Some are, though. And right off the bat, at number 45, we have George Walker Bush. The only way that George W. Bush isn't going to be number 45 is when he's inevitably number 46. 47, or 48, 49, 50, or anything else. Because honestly, I can't think of any other president that is worse than George W. Bush. The Iraq War, Patriot Act, NSA surveillance, Hurricane Katrina, the Bush tax cuts, Great Recession, and the fact that his administration is the most immediate explanation of a lot of the current situations going on now. Further right social views stemmed from his administration. The response of the Trump isolationism, that comes from hatred of the neoconservatives. The Obama neoliberal type thing is what was made in response to his sort of neoconservative rhetoric. It's just generally, he's just not that good. He's just terrible. He will not be rehabilitated. He's not a good person. And legitimately, objectively, worst president. Number 44, very similarly, we have James Buchanan, the only president that has directly led to our country to get involved in a civil war because he wouldn't put the South in their place. Because he was too busy fraternizing with his Southern boyfriend. Look, homophobia is okay as long as it's for people who are objectively evil. And people who support slavery are objectively evil. Okay, maybe I'm being a little hard. It's not like George W. Bush where he's actually the Satan devil. I think honestly, of the bottom ones, he's the one that is probably the least objectively bad, only because his situation was mostly passive, like, just letting everybody else do their thing, which is still bad, obviously. But, I guess compared to George W. Bush, he isn't that bad. And number 43, we have Herbert Hoover. The Great Depression, literally the biggest economic downturn the United States has ever faced in its history. And he did basically nothing. Now, I know what some people might say, like Mr. Pete said, like, oh, well, he did, like, technically some things. It's like, no, it's not good enough. When you compare him to his successor, the responses are basically night and day. So it's like, when you just take a look at it, it's just not that different. It's just not that good. Number 42, we have Donald John Trump. Honestly, there is not much else I can say. Honestly, like, if he was just, like, let's just say hypothetically, like, if he just did all of the bad things that he did in his first 3 years as president, whatever, he would probably be a little bit higher. But then comes the January 6th insurrection and all the last minute extremely fascistic stuff that he was doing in regards to the 2020 election. All of it basically knocking him down a peg after a peg after a peg after a peg. Above him at number 41, we have John Adams. Simply put, the Alien and Sedition Acts. Basically, the one thing he had to do to screw everything up. If he didn't do that, he probably would have been a bit more like mid-tier. Otherwise, just bad. Number 40, we have Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson, well known by a lot of historians as being pretty bad. Like, he was kind of good in a very loose sense of being extremely populist. Trying to end the Electoral College and sort of having this veneer of being a person of the common man. But it was a lot more of a demagoguish type, like, right-wing populism. He's well known for his incredibly short temper, his affinity to duel people despite its illegality, and his massive failure of the Trail of Tears. Or I guess in his mind, it was a success. Okay, above him, we have Franklin Pierce, whose biggest flaws are really just one bill, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which was one of the many, many, many steps that we took to getting closer to a civil war. If it were a good step to get us closer to a civil war, like he tries to free slaves and then the South gets mad at him, then maybe that'd be one thing. But it wasn't. Above him at 38, we have Ronald Reagan. Reagan, like, after learning everything more about Reagan, I really wanted to kind of put Reagan lower on the list, but just objectively taking a look at the rest of these guys, it's just like, you can't really put him lower, but you can't put him pretty low. Not doing anything about the AIDS epidemic, Reaganomics, expanding the war on drugs, Iran-Contra affair, and the fact that basically every point of modern history can be traced back to him. Like, most, if not all, of modern day problems can be traced back to Reagan. Biggest reason why the country is such a big shithole is literally because of Reagan's revolution and the rise of conservative politics that he basically instigated. Above him at number 37, Andrew Johnson. Basically, his whole failure is basically not doing anything about Reconstruction. Due to his tendencies to the South, he basically just let the South roam free, a thing that they should not have been doing immediately after the Civil War. Number 36, we have Warren Harding. Now, Warren Harding was typically seen as, like, objectively worse just because of blanket, like, corruption and scandals. But it's like, yeah, it's bad, but it's like, basically average, like, swing a dead cat in Washington and don't hate a corrupt politician. Plus, he commuted the sentence of Eugene B. Debs, so that's a plus. Above him, we have Richard Nixon. Watergate and the war on drugs, a lot of big things, but also he did some good things that are from the fact that he technically had roots within within the liberal wing of the Republican Party. He didn't have that many roots because he was originally from the conservative wing, but then joined the liberal wing to become the VP of Ike Eisenhower. But he still did do some things that are kind of similar. Like, I guess some Ike-ness rubbed off on him because we got the creation of the EPA easing tensions with China, and eventually pulling out of Vietnam. Above him, we have William McKinley. He fought for the gold standard, and he started the American Empire. In fact, when I started doing a little more research on him, I basically came to the conclusion that Czolgosz is probably the most justified in doing what he did. And man, only the 34th person on here had enough problems to justify that? That's really interesting. Anyways, 33, Millard Fillmore. He attempted to ease tensions in the Union, but many of his proposals were still just generally bad. Okay, next, Ulysses S. Grant. A lot of corruption, a lot of scandals, and a lot of bad things in his administration. But he did lead the Union, so I guess that's a plus. But that can only get him this far because we're supposed to be ranking their administrations, not them as people, and not them as whatever. Number 31, we have George H.W. Bush. While he did do good things like increase environmental protection, he failed on a lot of his promises, lied to get us into the Gulf War, and tried to be Ronald Reagan, but lacked any of the things that were, quote, redeeming factors of Ronald Reagan. Number 30, we have Rutherford B. Hayes. He fought for the gold standard, fought against unions, and tried to help Native Americans via assimilation programs. But I think, honestly, the biggest thing was this. Rutherford B. Hayes, even despite the fact that he was an abolitionist who defended refugee slaves, he 100% sold black Americans in the South out. Because this is literally what happened. In 1876, when it was his election against Samuel Tilden, it was a very contentious race. Both Tilden and Hayes had reasons to say that they were the ones who were in charge. And what ended up happening was Rutherford B. Hayes and the Republicans basically told Democrats, hey, you give us the presidency, and we give you the end of Reconstruction. And one of the things that they did was they would pull out Union soldiers from the South and would let the South basically do whatever the heck they wanted to do. They literally sold out their most prominent constituency in the South for political gain, like for short-term political gain. That's one of the primary reasons why the black Americans turned away from the Republican Party. Big L from Rutherford B. Hayes. Number 29, John Tyler. Simply put, Tyler is a traitor. He's the only U.S. president to be draped in a traitor's flag, so F you to him. Number 28, Martin Van Buren. He accomplished basically nothing during his presidency. And again, trying to be like a Democrat, he would try to appeal to Southerners and Northerners and not really push hard for the slavery issue, which is weird because then after he left office, he somehow became a huge advocate against slavery. It's like, really could have been useful when you were in the presidency. Number 27, we have James K. Polk, Mexican-American War to acquire Texas, L, but you have to give him at least some credit in just deciding to not seek another term after he accomplished all of his goals. Number 26, we have Gerald Ford. Dealt with a recession, supported the Equal Rights Amendment, pardoned Nixon, but overall didn't really do much. Pardoning Nixon, L, otherwise, whatever. Number 25, Calvin Coolidge. While I'm not a fan of a lot of his policies, he did do some good things. Campaigned for African American civil rights, Native American citizenship, and fixed many of the scandals in the Harding administration. And in the smack dab middle, we have William Henry Harrison at 24. Literally did nothing in his 30 days, 12 hours, and 30 minutes in the office. Literally the medium, literally the middle bar of what you can do as a president. Dude, literally nothing. I guess in some rankings you would put him on the way bottom because he didn't do anything. Right above him at 23, we have James Abram Garfield. His administration was rather short. He didn't do, in his short term, he did manage to do, a couple of tiny things. mostly fighting for civil rights reform and planned to abolish the spoils system. Number 22, we have Zachary Taylor. In his otherwise short and ineffective tenure, he avoided foreign entanglements, created a cabinet position, and made an actual attempt to make a peaceful anti-expansion compromise to slavery. Not only did he attempt to do some sort of compromise, but the compromise was actually somewhat in favor of abolition. At the very least, not expanding slavery. Number 21, we have Chester Alan Arthur. He basically has the spot that James Garfield would have gotten if he had actually served his full term. Basically just doing all the things that he wanted to do but couldn't. Most prominently, passing the Pendleton Act, which ended the spoils system. Number 20, we have Grover Cleveland. He was a non-interventionist. That's somewhat good. But he fought for the gold standard and against the Pullman strike. So, L. Number 19, we have William Howard Taft. He kept some of Teddy Roosevelt's good policies. He shifted significantly to the right and ignored the new nationalism and conservation efforts. So, L. Number 18, we have William Clinton. While he did make some attempts to do healthcare reform, he made good attempts on gun control and attempted to help with the Israel-Palestine conflict, he did a lot of bad things. He gutted welfare, repealed Glass-Steagall, expanded the prison population, the crime bill, and gave birth to the new Democrat third way philosophy. Big, massive L. Number 17, we have Barack Hussein Obama. While he did do some things I kind of like, Obamacare is alright, and I guess, he did make some social progress. Otherwise, half measures and kind of the same, plate of, what's the term? There's a term for it, the plate of roses. Basically, we were given a gift and it wasn't really anything beneficial. And at number 16, we have Joseph Robinette Biden. That's right, Dark Brandon is number 16 on this list. Due to the fact that he has an actual left in this time period, unlike Obama and Clinton, who didn't really have a prominent left wing to call out them on their issues, Biden has actually managed to do some good things. The NLRB decision, basically that's the one thing I can say that is good. There are some other things. I'm pretty sure you can look at the Kyle Kalinske and Brown Joy Gray debates where it's like the 15 things that he did that were good, but it's those are the things that are somewhat minor, but still prevalent enough to be good. Things that probably might have happened under Obama or Clinton that we probably wouldn't have even noticed, but due to the fact that, I think it's just because Biden seemed to be to the right of both of them objectively, but he has governed a lot more to the left of those two. Again, thanks to the fact that we actually have a prominent left this time. Number 15, we have Benjamin Harrison. Fought hard for African American civil rights against monopolies, but was still very heavily anti-Native American and massacred the Sioux over a misunderstanding. Number 14, we have Ike Eisenhower. While he did do some things that furthered tensions with the USSR, he also helped further civil rights, looked past partisanship by teaming up with Democrats and calling out certain Republicans, established NASA, and warned against the military-industrial complex. Number 13, one that's still this low, Woodrow Wilson. You see, because throughout the whole time that I've done this video series, throughout the whole time I've been doing this, we've had two shifts in Woodrow Wilson. Because when I first started this, we were starting to see this big shift of Woodrow Wilson where people were having all of these extremely negative positions on Woodrow Wilson. But now we're starting to see Woodrow Wilson come back in the limelight. All of a sudden we're seeing people like Woodrow Wilson again. But the fact of the matter is, both of these sides have reasons to understandably explain why they like and why they hate Woodrow Wilson. And objectively, he is of the better of the US presidents, but that doesn't mean by much. Number 12, James Madison, most of his tenure was defined by the War of 1812, so there really isn't that much to rank, except the fact that it's like, I guess he did good in that war, and it was one of the few wars that the U.S. had that was actually justified, so hooray. Number 11, we have Thomas Jefferson. That's right, Jefferson has been knocked down this low. Simply put, I mean, he owned slaves and he raped a 13-year-old. Pretty bad. But we can't deny his benefits. The apostle of democracy, blocking the slave trade of 1806, and fighting extensively for civil liberties and secularism. But again, raped 13-year-old girl. Massive L. Number 10, we have James Monroe, passed the Missouri Compromise and drafted the Monroe Doctrine as a way to help Latin American revolutions. Unfortunately, now it is used in the contrast, so kind of L, but also kind of W. Number 9, we have John Quincy Adams, great character and intelligence, more respectful to the natives and slaves than other older presidents and even some presidents after him, helped infrastructure and drafted important aspects of the Monroe Doctrine. And number 8, we have George Washington. I guess he raised up. I only put him that low when the first ranking was just because it was like, I was sick and tired of everybody like being like, George Washington, he's so awesome. But it's like, I mean, when you look at it, when you compare him to the rest of the people in the list, it's like, there really ain't nowhere for him to go but up. Number 7, we have Harry S. Truman. His Fair Deal attempted to continue certain New Deal policies, and aspects of the Marshall Plan that he enacted were good, but not all of it. Berlin Airlift and the UN, and he would be a generally good president, and a lot of people probably would have very favorable views of him if it weren't for if he never did that, then that would probably get him a little higher on the list. Actually, probably not, because the rest of these guys on this list are actually pretty good. And I say this because the next person on this list is, oh boy, I cannot believe I slept on this person. Because after doing more research, because this is what caused my attention to sort of shift of them. Not just they had generally positive things. We all knew that of all of the modern day alive presidents that he was probably the best one. I think most, if not all, people knew this. But it wasn't until I listened to an FD Signifier video that he said something that made my head go, huh. Because he said that this president was the closest thing that we ever had to having a socialist president. And just hearing that phrase made me go, because that was perplexing. It's like, this guy was noticeably further to the left than most people, I would think. He has a tradition, black radical political movement. So it's like, the fact that he is saying this should definitely catch your attention. It might not necessarily be true, but it's like, the fact that he is saying it should catch your attention. And then I decided to look further into the actual things they did, because most of the people, when they think of this guy's administration, they think of two things. And yes, when you think of those two things, you think massive L. But then when you actually look at all the other things he did, you start seeing that L magically start turning into a W. I guess we should stop beating around the bush, because number 6 is James Earl Carter Jr. Ignoring the stagflation in the Iran hostage crisis, Jimmy was honestly a really fucking good president. And a lot of us slept on him. We all slept on him. Everybody in America slept on him. In the 1980 election, everybody slept on him and was just like, no, this guy's bad. We should get rid of him. And they ended up replacing him with Reagan, who was just objectively terrible. Even just based on that alone, that would probably indicate something, but it's when you actually analyze the things that he did, it's wow. He shifted U.S. foreign policy to be peace-based, stopped funding far-right governments in Nicaragua, Argentina, Brazil, and Chile due to their human rights abuses, and was one of the only presidents, because, like, a lot of presidents have said this. Like, we hear this all the time. Like, FDR said, oh, a national health service would be a good idea. Teddy Roosevelt said, oh, a national health service would be a good idea. Then we get, like, Truman said, oh, that'd be a good idea. Kennedy, oh, that might be a good idea. Like, Clinton and Obama both now say, oh, a single-payer system might actually be a good idea. But Jimmy Carter was, like, one of the few presidents to actually start trying to do something to put that into action. In the meantime, he expanded social programs, but he was laying the groundwork for a potential national health service in America, which would have been a massively big W if he actually ended up doing that. It's just like, wow. Like, when he goes, this guy's gonna get a full episode, and it's just like, objectively, this guy, massive W, and the fact that people replaced this guy with fucking Reagan was just absolutely massive L. And now we've reached the top 5, which should kind of be pretty obvious at this point, but we'll get through it anyways. Number 5, we have JFK, the New Frontier policies, founding of the Peace Corps, and supporting the Civil Rights Movement. However, unfortunately, he didn't do much really to, like, change the Civil Rights Movement and make it, like, big, like, pushing it further into its success. But he did do a lot of good. Though I will say, there's one big thing, like, I should mention this, because this is the one big thing that is very massive L. The whole, like, I mentioned him founding the Peace Corps, but I should make it very abundantly clear. He was no peacenik. Like, that's one of the big things that I see a lot of people say, but he is no peacenik. He was a Cold War hawk. In fact, on foreign policy, he tried to be more of a, like, right-wing person on foreign policy, specifically because he didn't want his other domestic policies to trick people into thinking that he was further left than he actually was. But his domestic policy was pretty good, so we have to give him a massive W on that. Number 4, we have Abraham Lincoln. Freed the slaves, stopped the Confederacy. Not much else to say. Next. Number 3, Teddy Roosevelt. Progressive conservationist with a lot of charisma. And when his party couldn't get shit done, he left and formed his own. Trust busting and just generally a lot of progressive stuff. He gets a massive L due to his foreign policy, but then again, basically every president gets a massive L due to their foreign policy. I guess except for Carter, and I guess number 1. Number 2, we have LBJ. Civil rights, Great Society, Medicare, Medicaid, war on poverty, expanded NASA. But he can't be number 1 because Vietnam War. And of course, let's just not beat around the bush. Number 1, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. New Deal, doing his best to lead us during World War II, and basically being the real closest thing we've ever had to a socialist president. He's no socialist, let's be clear. At most, he's a right-wing social democrat, but otherwise, again, generally good. So yeah, ranking of the US presidents once more. Do you agree with my rankings, or do you disagree with my rankings? Leave your thoughts in the comment section below. Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe, and click the bell to notify when a future video of mine comes out. And for some more content from me, you can go to our website, follow me on Twitter, join my Discord, or consider supporting me on Patreon.